The harsh equatorial sun beat down on the B-25 Mitchell, its twin engines straining against the humid air over the cerulean expanse of the Southwest Pacific in March 1942. Inside the cramped cockpit, Lieutenant Commander John Smith wrestled with the controls, his eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering Japanese convoy below. This was their third sortie this week against the same supply route, and the results, as always, were dishearteningly predictable. High-altitude bombing, the doctrine of the day, dictated that precision would come from above the range of enemy anti-aircraft fire, allowing bombers to drop their payloads with impunity. But impunity did not translate to accuracy. The small, agile Japanese cargo ships and their escorting destroyers were infuriatingly difficult targets from 5,000 feet up. Smith gritted his teeth, the vibration of the aircraft a constant tremor through his bones. Each bomb run felt like an exercise in futility. They would line up, the bombardier would squint through his Norden bomb sight, release the ordnance, and then watch as the tiny specks plummeted towards the ocean, more often than not exploding harmlessly in the water, sending up geysers that merely washed the decks of the enemy vessels. The Japanese captains, adept at evasive maneuvers, seemed to dance their ships out of harm's way with contemptuous ease. Frustration was a slow-burning fire in the belly of every bomber crewman in the theater. They were risking their lives, flying hundreds of miles over hostile waters, only to watch their efforts achieve little more than a splash. The official reports spoke of near misses and harassment, but Smith knew the truth. They were failing to dent the enemy's vital supply lines. Their bombers were potent machines, yet their efficacy against naval targets was woefully inadequate. This dire situation, however, was about to meet its match in an unlikely figure. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a man whose official military rank belied his true nature. Gunn was not a career officer, nor a product of military academies. He was a civilian-turned-military engineer, a former barnstormer and commercial pilot who had been running an airline in the Philippines when the war broke out. His experience was in making things fly, fixing things, and, most importantly, solving practical problems with audacious, often unconventional solutions. He saw the shortcomings of the existing doctrine not as insurmountable obstacles, but as engineering challenges waiting for a radical answer. His mind was a perpetual motion machine of tinkering and innovation. The prevailing wisdom held an almost religious conviction in the power of precision bombing from altitude. High-flying formations, dropping bombs with sophisticated optical sights, were believed to be the ultimate weapon against any target, be it industrial complexes, airfields, or ships at sea. They believed precision bombing from altitude would win the war at sea. They were catastrophically wrong. The sheer scale of the Pacific Ocean, the constantly moving targets, and the limitations of early war bombing technology meant that most bombs simply missed. The valuable Japanese convoys, laden with vital resources, continued to ply the waters largely unmolested, fueling their war machine with minimal interruption from Allied air power. This glaring inefficiency was a cancer eating away at Allied morale and strategy. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Paul Gunn watched the dismal returns, the reports of valiant but ineffectual missions, with a growing sense of urgency and fury. He wasn't content to simply lament the situation. He was driven to change it. His intuition, honed by years of practical aviation experience, told him that a different approach was needed, one that defied the textbooks and the established thinking of the Army Air Force High Command. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber designed for horizontal bombing runs, and saw something else entirely. He envisioned a flying gun platform, a machine capable of delivering overwhelming firepower directly into the hulls of enemy ships, not from a safe distance, but from point-blank range. This was not about dropping bombs. It was about tearing targets apart with a hail of bullets. He was about to embark on a crusade that would fundamentally alter the role of the B-25 and, in doing so, revolutionize naval air warfare. His obsession, born from a desperate necessity, would transform these medium bombers into ship-killing monsters. His radical vision, ridiculed by many, would ultimately tear apart Japanese convoys and rewrite the rules of engagement in the Pacific. Paul Gunn's personal motivation was not simply a desire for victory. It was a visceral, burning need to liberate his family. Every minute his wife Polly and his children spent in a Japanese internment camp was a minute too long, a constant gnawing torment that fueled his every thought and action. He carried their faces in his mind, a powerful talisman against despair, and a relentless spur to action. He knew with absolute certainty that the current high-altitude bombing strategy was not going to achieve the decisive results needed to turn the tide quickly enough. It was too slow, too inefficient, and too easily evaded by the resourceful Japanese. His family's plight imbued him with an impatience and a willingness to defy conventional wisdom that few others possessed. The stakes for him were immeasurable. Gunn watched the B-25s take off, their bomb bays full, only to return hours later with the same empty bomb bays, and often with very little to report in terms of hits. He observed the pilots' frustration, the weary slump of their shoulders after yet another ineffective mission. He knew these men wanted to fight, wanted to inflict real damage, but the tools and tactics they were given were simply not up to the task. He understood that the problem wasn't the bravery of the pilots or the capabilities of the aircraft itself, but the method of attack. Bombs dropped from several thousand feet, even with the aid of a Norden bomb sight, were simply not precise enough for small maneuvering ships. The margin of error was too great, the window of opportunity too brief. Then, the radical idea began to coalesce in his mind, drawing from his own experiences as a bush pilot and his innate understanding of close-quarters flying. What if, instead of trying to hit a moving ship with falling bombs from a distance, they attacked it directly, head-on, with concentrated machine gun fire? What if they turned the medium bomber, a B-25, designed for dropping bombs, into a massive flying gun platform, an airborne battleship? He envisioned the aircraft flying at masthead height, directly into the enemy convoy, unleashing a storm of lead that would shred the superstructure, disable the crew, and ignite fuel tanks, rather than simply hoping a bomb might land near enough to cause some damage. This was not bombing. This was strafing. This was close-quarters combat in the air. His concept was revolutionary but also deeply controversial. Conventional military doctrine held that bombers were for bombing, fighters for fighting. To suggest that a medium bomber, with its relatively slow speed and lack of maneuverability compared to a fighter, should engage targets at low altitude, exposing itself to intense anti-aircraft fire, was seen as suicidal. It flew in the face of all established wisdom. Such a tactic would invite heavy casualties, not only from shipboard defenses, but also from potential collisions with the mastheads and rigging of the very vessels they were attacking. It was a complete paradigm shift, suggesting that the primary weapon of a bomber might not be its bombs, but its forward-firing machine guns. When Gunn first presented his idea to the Army Air Force brass, he met with a wall of resistance. "Major Gunn," he was likely told in various forms, "bombers are designed for bombing. High altitude is for safety and precision. We do not engage in frontal assaults on fortified ships with medium bombers. That is a job for torpedo planes or dive bombers, which we currently lack in sufficient numbers, or our naval forces." The traditionalists, many of whom had trained in the pre-war era, were deeply ingrained in the doctrine of strategic bombing. The thought of modifying expensive B-25s for such a seemingly crude and dangerous mission was met with skepticism, disdain, and outright refusal. Generals cited pilot safety, logistical nightmares, and the unproven nature of such a radical approach. They argued it was a waste of valuable resources and aircraft. But Gunn was tenacious. He possessed a stubborn streak, born of desperation and conviction. He argued that the current approach was already proving costly in terms of morale and strategic time, if not yet in aircraft. He pointed to the empirical evidence of failing bomb runs. He didn't care about established doctrine. He cared about results, about hitting the enemy where it hurt, and about getting his family back. He persisted, cajoling, arguing, and using every ounce of his considerable persuasive charm and technical knowledge. He had to prove not just that his idea could work, but that it was the only way to effectively prosecute the air war against Japanese shipping in the Pacific. He needed an opportunity, a chance to bypass the bureaucratic inertia and demonstrate his audacious vision in practice. The stakes were too high for him to simply give up. Gunn's persistence eventually paid off, fueled by the growing desperation over the ineffectiveness of conventional tactics. He secured grudging permission from sympathetic commanders, those who were equally frustrated by the lack of results, to experiment. The Southwest Pacific Theater, far from the established supply chains and rigid structures of the continental United States, offered a unique environment for improvisation. Official channels were slow, but ingenuity born of necessity could sometimes cut through the red tape. Gunn found his workshop in Australia, in various maintenance depots and aircraft repair units that had been hastily set up. These were often rudimentary facilities, staffed by resourceful mechanics who shared Gunn's pragmatic, problem-solving spirit. They were often working with limited tools and spare parts, a challenge that Gunn relished. His first target for modification was a B-25C Mitchell bomber. The standard B-25 already carried several 50 caliber machine guns in its nose and dorsal turret for defensive purposes, but none of these were designed for concentrated forward-firing attack. Gunn's initial concept focused on augmenting the aircraft's existing firepower. The standard B-25 had a glazed nose housing the bombardier. This, Gunn decided, was wasted space for his new mission. He envisioned stripping out the bombardier's station and replacing it with solid metal plating, then installing an array of fixed, forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns directly into the nose cone. The goal was to transform the bomber's silhouette from a relatively soft observational position into a hardened, aggressive gun platform. The technical challenges were formidable. Simply bolting guns onto an aircraft was not enough. Each 50 caliber machine gun was a powerful weapon, generating significant recoil and requiring a substantial amount of ammunition. The first step was to reinforce the airframe in the nose to absorb the stress of multiple guns firing simultaneously. This involved welding new steel plates and structural supports. Then came the challenge of mounting the guns themselves. They had to be precisely aligned to converge their fire at a specific distance, typically a few hundred yards in front of the aircraft, to ensure maximum impact on the target. This required custom fabricated gun mounts and sighting mechanisms. Next, the ammunition feed systems needed a complete overhaul. Standard ammunition boxes were too small and too difficult to access during flight. Gunn and his team designed and built custom ammunition chutes and large capacity boxes that could hold thousands of rounds. These had to be routed from within the fuselage, through the cockpit and into each gun, ensuring a continuous, reliable supply of firepower during an attack run. The weight of the guns and ammunition also presented significant issues. Each 50 caliber machine gun weighed over 60 pounds, and thousands of rounds of ammunition added hundreds of pounds more. This extra weight, concentrated in the nose, drastically altered the aircraft's balance and center of gravity. Test flights revealed immediate handling problems, requiring adjustments to trim and sometimes even ballast to restore stability. The electrical systems also needed to be rewired to manage the simultaneous firing of multiple weapons, along with the installation of new gun cameras to record combat effectiveness. The initial modifications were modest, featuring a pair of additional 50 caliber machine guns mounted in pods on the sides of the fuselage, just below the cockpit, in addition to the existing forward-firing guns already present in the upper nose. This brought the forward-firing firepower to 4 50 caliber guns. With this prototype, Gunn personally flew some of the first test missions. The ideal proving ground presented itself in the vast, contested waters of the Bismarck Sea, a vital artery for Japanese shipping. He led a small group of converted B-25s on low-level reconnaissance and attack missions, cautiously testing the new tactics against isolated Japanese vessels or small patrol boats. These early tests were not about sinking major warships, but about validating the concept. Could a B-25 effectively strafe a ship from low altitude? And could the modified aircraft withstand the stresses and deliver its payload of bullets? The initial results, though limited, were promising enough to push for further development. The sound of 4 50 caliber machine guns roaring to life from the nose of a B-25 was an entirely different proposition than a distant bomb falling from the sky. It was a raw, visceral display of destructive power. The true test of Major Gunn's modifications came not in the workshops, but in the crucible of combat seen through the eyes of the pilots who flew these newly armed machines. Among the first to embrace the radical new tactic was Captain George C. Kaiser, a seasoned B-25 pilot known for his aggressive flying. On one of his early missions with a gun-modified B-25, Kaiser approached a small Japanese freighter steaming through the Bismarck Sea. Instead of climbing to altitude for a bombing run, he dropped to wave-top height, racing towards the ship at over 200 miles per hour. The experience was exhilarating and terrifying. The sea rushed by just below his wings, and the ship's mastheads seemed to grow impossibly fast. It was like flying a fighter, but with the punch of a battleship, Kaiser later recounted to his squadron mates. As he closed the distance, he unleashed the 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. The roar was deafening, even through the aircraft's structure, and the tracer rounds arced brilliantly towards the target. He could see the impact of the heavy machine gun rounds tearing into the ship's superstructure, sparking and ripping through the metal. Smoke poured from the ship's bridge and figures could be seen scattering on deck. The difference from his previous high-altitude bombing runs was night and day. There was no guesswork, no abstract calculation. It was direct, kinetic destruction. Kaiser pulled up sharply over the ship, feeling the concussive force of his own guns and the rising bursts of anti-aircraft fire from the now alerted vessel. The freighter was crippled, its engines likely damaged, its crew in disarray. Another pilot, Lieutenant Kelsey R. Wood, flying a similar mission, found himself targeting a Japanese patrol craft. He dove so low that his propeller tips almost touched the waves. The thrill of the low-level attack was palpable. "You could almost shake hands with the enemy crew," Wood later joked, though the reality was far more grim for the Japanese sailors. The sheer volume of fire delivered by the fixed guns ripped through the patrol boat's wooden hull and small bridge, silencing its defensive weapons in a matter of seconds. The small craft quickly began to list, smoke billowing from its engine room. These initial tentative successes started to chip away at the skepticism of the combat crews. They saw with their own eyes the devastating effect of concentrated strafing fire, a stark contrast to the often fruitless bombing runs. The comparison in results was undeniable. While conventional high-altitude bombing continued to yield hit rates well below 5%, the low-level strafing attacks, even with just a few forward guns, achieved direct hits with almost every pass. The damage inflicted was not just superficial, it was designed to disable and destroy, ripping through sensitive control systems, engine rooms, and personnel. The psychological impact on the Japanese crews was also immense. Instead of bombs falling from a distant, unseen enemy, they were being savaged by an aircraft that appeared out of the horizon at lightning speed, spewing a terrifying torrent of lead directly into their faces. This close-range, aggressive approach was unprecedented and deeply unnerving. Word of guns commerce destroyers began to spread like wildfire among the pilots and ground crews. They saw the potential, the way these modified B-25s could finally make a real impact on the Japanese shipping lanes. Requests for the modifications started to pour into the Australian workshops, bypassing official channels as much as possible. Pilots wanted to fly these new machines. They wanted to feel like they were making a difference instead of just going through the motions. The frustration that had gnawed at them for months began to transform into a renewed sense of purpose and a hunger for combat. However, the High Command remained largely unconvinced. Many senior officers still clung to the established doctrine, viewing guns improvisations as a crude, dangerous, and unsustainable deviation. They worried about the increased vulnerability of aircraft flying at low altitude, the potential for heavy losses, and the general breakdown of standardized procedures. Gunn's methods were unorthodox, his personality challenging, and his disregard for bureaucratic norms often infuriating to those above him. Despite the growing chorus of support from the front lines, the battle for widespread acceptance of the Strafe concept was far from over. It would take more than a few successful skirmishes. It would take a monumental demonstration of overwhelming destructive power to fully sway the skeptics. Major Paul Gunn was not one to rest on his laurels. The initial successes with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, while encouraging, were merely the beginning of his vision. He knew that to truly devastate Japanese convoys, to overwhelm their defenses and sink ships quickly, he needed more firepower. His workshops in Australia became a hive of intense round-the-clock activity, pushing the boundaries of aircraft modification with a relentless drive. The concept of the commerce destroyer was evolving rapidly, morphing from an aggressive strafer into an aerial assault weapon of unprecedented lethality. The progression of firepower was astonishingly swift. The initial 4-gun configuration quickly gave way to 8. This involved installing additional pairs of guns in the fuselage sides, often in blister packs that protruded slightly from the aircraft's skin. The internal structure needed further reinforcement, and the ammunition feed systems became even more complex, requiring more and larger ammunition boxes to sustain the prolonged bursts of fire. Each addition demanded meticulous recalculation of weight and balance, forcing Gunn and his team to continually re-engineer existing components. The roar of 8 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously was an awe-inspiring sound, a sustained tearing sound that spoke of immense destructive force. But 8 guns were still not enough for Gunn. He pushed for 12. This involved not only the nose and side mounts, but also incorporating guns in the lower fuselage or even experimenting with unique configurations to maximize the forward-facing arc of fire. The B-25 airframe, never designed for such an armament, was pushed to its absolute limits. Imagine the engineering challenge: running ammunition belts for thousands of rounds, managing the heat generated by a dozen heavy machine guns, and ensuring the pilot could still fly and control the aircraft effectively under the immense recoil. The vibrations alone from such a fusillade were enough to shake rivets loose and test the structural integrity of the airframe. Yet Gunn's modifications were remarkably robust, a testament to his practical engineering genius. Finally, the ultimate iteration emerged: the 14-gun monster. This involved 8 50 caliber machine guns fixed in the nose, often staggered in 2 rows of 4, plus 4 more in side blister packs and 2 more in the belly or even angled slightly downwards. The sheer weight of armament and ammunition was staggering. A B-25, originally designed to carry a bomb load, was now sacrificing much of that capacity for thousands of rounds of heavy machine gun ammunition. When a 14-gun B-25 opened fire, it unleashed a torrent of approximately 10 0.0 rounds per minute. This was not just strafing. It was the aerial equivalent of a broadside from a battleship, concentrated on a single vulnerable point. The aircraft became an engine of pure, unadulterated destruction, a flying hammer. This dramatic evolution culminated just in time for one of the most decisive air-sea battles of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. This was to be the proving ground, the ultimate test of Gunn's radical modifications and tactics. The Japanese, desperately needing to reinforce their forces in New Guinea, assembled a large convoy consisting of 8 troop transports and 8 escorting destroyers, carrying approximately 900 troops and vital supplies. They believed the weather and the strength of their escort would provide sufficient cover. They were tragically mistaken. The morning of March 2, 1943, dawned ominous and grey over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy, steaming confidently towards Leh, was spotted by an Allied patrol plane. The word went out, and the commerce destroyers, Major Gunn's modified B-25s, along with other Allied aircraft, scrambled into action. What followed over the next 3 days was an aerial massacre that forever changed naval warfare. Imagine the perspective from the bridge of the Japanese transport Kyokusei Maru. Captain Tanaka, a veteran of several naval engagements, peered through his binoculars at the hazy horizon. His confidence, bolstered by the destroyer escort and heavy anti-aircraft weaponry, began to fray as the first wave of aircraft appeared. These were not the high-flying bombers he was accustomed to. These were flying low, incredibly low, skimming the waves like angry seabirds. His heart pounded as he realized the true nature of the attack. They weren't dropping bombs from afar, they were coming directly for them. The air immediately filled with the staccato bark of his ship's anti-aircraft guns, their tracers lacing the sky. But the speed and low altitude of the attackers made them incredibly difficult to hit. Lieutenant John P. Maguire, a B-25 pilot from the 38th Bomb Group, led his flight of 4 modified Mitchells, each bristling with 8 50 caliber machine guns. His target was a troop transport, a large dark shape against the churning sea. He descended to mere feet above the water, the spray from his wingtips visible through the cockpit glass. "Hold steady, boys, let's give them hell," he yelled over the intercom. As he closed to within a few hundred yards, he pressed the firing button. The nose of his B-25 erupted in a sheet of flame and smoke as 8 machine guns roared, their collective recoil a violent shudder through the airframe. Streams of .50 caliber bullets, like solid beams of light, tore into the Kyokusei Maru. He saw the bridge glass shatter, the deck plating rip open, and desperate figures thrown from their positions. The smell of cordite filled his cockpit, acrid and intoxicating. He pulled up sharply, the aircraft groaning under the G-forces, as his wingmen followed, pouring more fire into the crippled ship. The combined force of strafing B-25s, B-17s conducting skip bombing, and Beaufighters raking the decks was overwhelming. The modified B-25s focused their efforts on the transports, their fusillades silencing anti-aircraft positions, tearing through engine rooms and igniting fuel tanks. Captain Tanaka watched in horror as his ship was ravaged. Fires broke out, smoke billowed, and the screams of his men filled the air. The Kyokusei Maru was hit again and again, becoming a floating inferno. Its main engines were disabled, steering gear destroyed. The ship began to settle slowly into the water, a testament to the concentrated firepower. The battle raged for 3 days, a relentless aerial onslaught. The modified B-25s proved devastatingly effective. They shredded the superstructures of the Japanese transports and destroyers, disabling their guns, decapitating command and control, and causing catastrophic fires. The sheer volume of lead sprayed from a 14-gun B-25 was enough to turn a ship's deck into Swiss cheese in a matter of seconds. The Japanese forces fought valiantly, their anti-aircraft guns firing until they ran out of ammunition or were silenced by the relentless strafing, but they were largely helpless against the combined assault. The statistics from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were staggering and deeply humiliating for the Japanese. Out of the 8 troop transports, all 8 were sunk. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers were also sent to the bottom. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, and the entire reinforcement effort to New Guinea was annihilated. Allied losses, by comparison, were minimal, with only 4 aircraft lost. The amount of ammunition expended by the B-25s was enormous, but every round seemed to find its mark. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Allies, particularly the pilots, who had suffered months of frustration, it was a triumphant vindication of Major Gunn's radical vision. They had found a way to not just harass, but utterly destroy enemy shipping. For the Japanese, it was a terrifying demonstration of a new, overwhelming form of aerial warfare. They had underestimated the Allies' ingenuity and the sheer destructive power that could be wielded from low altitude. The Bismarck Sea became a graveyard for their hopes of reinforcing New Guinea and a chilling example of the destructive potential of Paul Gunn's 14-gun monsters. The era of distant, ineffective bombing was over. The resounding victory at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea served as the ultimate undeniable proof of concept for Major Paul Gunn's radical B-25 modifications and low-level strafing tactics. The success was so dramatic, the destruction so complete, that skepticism from the high command evaporated almost overnight. News of the commerce destroyers and their devastating effectiveness spread rapidly throughout the Pacific theater. What was once dismissed as a Maverick's folly was now recognized as a critical tactical innovation. Within months, the Strafer B-25 concept was adopted across all major Allied air forces operating in the Pacific. Aircraft mechanics and engineers, often working from crude diagrams and verbal instructions disseminated through combat reports, began to replicate Gunn's modifications. Factory production lines eventually incorporated these changes directly, creating new variants of the B-25, such as the B-25G and B-25H, which came standard with multiple fixed forward-firing guns, including powerful 75mm cannons. The era of the gun-nose bomber had truly begun, transforming the B-25 from a medium bomber into a versatile ground and sea attack platform. But Gunn, ever the innovator, was not content to simply rest on the success of the Hein 50 caliber Strafer. He continually pushed the boundaries of aerial firepower. He experimented with even heavier armaments, notably installing a powerful 75mm cannon into the nose of a B-25. This was an audacious move, taking a weapon typically found on tanks and attempting to mount it in an aircraft designed for flight. The technical challenges were immense, managing the incredible recoil feeding the large shells and structurally integrating such a heavy weapon. Yet he succeeded, creating an aircraft capable of firing high-explosive shells directly into the hulls of ships, effectively turning the B-25 into a flying artillery piece. These cannon-equipped B-25s provided an even more potent punch, capable of tearing larger holes and inflicting greater damage on reinforced targets. Beyond hardware, Gunn also championed and refined tactics like skip bombing. While not solely his invention, he was instrumental in its perfection and widespread adoption. Skip bombing involved releasing bombs at an extremely low altitude and high speed, causing them to literally skip across the water's surface and strike the enemy ship at its waterline where it was most vulnerable. This, combined with the strafing runs, meant that Japanese ships were not only being raked with machine gun fire from above deck, but also hit with powerful bombs at the most critical point below the waterline. The coordination between strafing and skip bombing became a hallmark of the Allied air assault on Japanese convoys. Amidst this relentless innovation and strategic success, Major Paul Gunn carried a heavy personal burden. His wife Polly and their 4 children remained interned in the Santo Tomas camp. The war for him was deeply personal, and every innovation, every successful mission brought him one step closer to their liberation. As the tide of the war slowly began to turn in the Allies' favor and the front lines advanced, the prospect of their rescue became a tangible hope rather than a distant dream. In February 1945, after years of agonizing waiting and relentless fighting, the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division spearheaded the liberation of Manila. Among the thousands of emaciated and suffering internees freed from Santo Tomas were Polly Gunn and her children. The reunion was a profoundly emotional one, a testament to the unwavering hope and fierce determination that had fueled Paul Gunn throughout the darkest days of the war. His personal quest, intertwined with the larger conflict, had finally found its resolution. It was a victory not just for the Allies, but for one man's family, a poignant echo of the immense personal stakes that drove so many individuals during the conflict. The man who had reshaped aerial warfare had at last brought his family home. The impact of Paul Gunn's commerce destroyers on Japanese logistics was nothing short of catastrophic. Before the widespread adoption of strafer tactics, Japanese convoys had enjoyed a relatively high degree of immunity from Allied air attack. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the subsequent proliferation of gun-nose B-25s, the tables were dramatically turned. Japanese shipping lanes, once vital arteries, became death traps. The continuous and devastating attrition of transports laden with troops and supplies choked off the flow of critical resources to their forward garrisons. Without reinforcements, food, fuel, and ammunition, many Japanese outposts in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and other remote Pacific islands were slowly starved into submission. The cumulative effect of these strafing and skip-bombing attacks was immense. By 1944, Japanese shipping losses due to Allied air power had skyrocketed, severely crippling their ability to sustain their war effort. Oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaysia, iron ore from the Philippines. These vital raw materials were now often sunk before they could reach the factories of the Japanese home islands. This disruption of logistics was a crucial, though often unsung, factor in the Allied victory in the Pacific. It forced the Japanese to divert precious resources to anti-submarine and anti-aircraft measures, further straining their already overstretched military. The 14-gun monsters had not only shredded convoys, but had also shredded the very economic and logistical foundations of the Japanese war machine. After the war, Major Paul Gunn's extraordinary contributions were recognized, though perhaps not with the widespread public acclaim of some other wartime heroes. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Air Medal, a testament to his valor and ingenuity. He retired from the Air Force in 1946, having served his country and his family with unparalleled dedication. His life after the war saw him continue to work in aviation, returning to his passion for flying and developing new aerial techniques, always with that same practical problem-solving mindset. Gunn's legacy extends far beyond the specific modifications to the B-25. He embodied the spirit of wartime innovation, demonstrating how a singular individual, driven by personal stakes and an unconventional mind, could fundamentally alter the course of military doctrine. His willingness to challenge the status quo, to ignore rigid protocols, and to literally build solutions with his own hands, transformed a conventional bomber into one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons of the war. The gunship concept, refined and expanded, would eventually see further development in later conflicts, a direct lineage traceable to Gunn's initial audacious experiments. The broader lesson from Paul Gunn's story is a powerful one. Innovation is often born from necessity and personal stakes. When conventional approaches fail, it is the mavericks, the lateral thinkers, the ones willing to risk failure and defy authority, who often find the breakthroughs. Gunn didn't wait for permission, he created it. He didn't merely identify a problem, he engineered a solution, sacrificing safety and comfort for efficacy. His unwavering belief in his vision, coupled with the desperate plight of his family, gave him the strength to overcome bureaucratic inertia and technological hurdles. He showed that sometimes the most effective way to fight is not from a distance, but to get up close and personal, to bring overwhelming force directly to bear. The noise of a B-25, nose bristling with guns tearing into an enemy convoy, became the sound of a strategic shift, a testament to one man's fierce resolve. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.